When I'm talking about the inner lives of sounds, I guess I'm thinking about all the details that we can't hear in just our daily lives. We pass through so many sounds. I mean, every instant has its own sounds, and we're not able to process all of that information. We just hear what is useful for us. So composing for me, I think involves like really slowing down and trying to really live inside of the sonorities that we already have around us. And also that exist in, instruments around us and things like that. So I think more than anything, the inner lives of sounds in my process means taking recordings and slowing them down and processing them. And through repetition, you can hear new details in a recording, and then you can create something from that and record it and then listen again and hear something new.
This is Music Maker with Tyler Kline, a podcast from Loose Leaf Transmissions. Hey there, y'all, and welcome to another edition of the podcast. If this is your first time listening, it's so great to have you along, and just to fill you in on what we're all about, my name is Tyler, and I'm a composer, a radio broadcaster, a curator, producer, the list goes on, but mostly I would simply say that I am a maker. I just really love to make things, make music, make art, whatever it may be. And on this podcast, I sit down with other creative people to discuss their journey, process, philosophies, basically whatever it is that makes them who they are and inspires them to be makers themselves. And if you've been listening for a bit, I really appreciate it. It's good to have you back. On today's episode of Music Maker, I'm joined by Hannah Selin. Composer, violist, and vocalist, Hannah Selin works with acoustic instruments, voices, electronics, and field recordings to create striking and vibrant sound worlds. She grew up in southeastern Pennsylvania, helping her parents caretake a cemetery and listening to her mother write songs on scordatura guitar. Her music carries from this a sense of the supernatural, a closeness with the earth, and a love of all things resonant. Hannah is co-founder and lead singer with the band GADADU and violist and founding member of Xanthoria Quartet and Violalia Duo. As a violist, Hannah performs with chamber groups and orchestras throughout the New York metropolitan area. So I just loved talking with Hannah about her work and how she thinks about music. And of course, we discuss her journey and how her entry point into music composition was quite a bit different than maybe most people, and also how she works with manipulating sound in order to discover interesting musical material. Nature is also a significant part of Hannah's creative process, and we get into that quite a bit. And we bond over our mutual love of the Italian author Italo Calvino. By the way, in this conversation, Hannah briefly touches on the fact that she's a new mom. She has about a 3 or 4 month old baby, but it's not something we really discuss much in detail. However, you may hear a little bit of baby sounds in the background at times. It's nothing too distracting, and also the baby totally supervised and safe. It's just something that you may notice. Anyway, Hannah's work is absolutely fascinating, and the way she talks about sound and music is equally fascinating, so I hope you enjoy this conversation as much as I did. Just a skosh of business to take care of before we jump into this conversation. One of the simplest and indeed the best way for you to support this podcast. It's so easy. All you got to do is do what you're doing now. Listen to this episode, listen to earlier episodes if you haven't already, or re-listen to them if you want to revisit them. Share this podcast with friends who might enjoy listening to these conversations, and then give us a follow on your favorite streaming platform. That'll ensure that you get the newest episode of the podcast as soon as it's released, pushed straight to your device. Also, an equally impactful way to help the Music Maker podcast is to leave a rating and, if you can, a review if you feel inclined and if you have a little bit of time. We've gotten a couple of those so far, and it's been so great to share your thoughts, and I'd love to share more of those here on the podcast. So if you feel strongly about the show, if you value these conversations, please do be in touch. You can leave a review on Apple Podcasts if that's where you listen, or if you listen on Spotify, you can now leave comments on each individual episode and kind of get some conversation going there, I suppose. So ratings, reviews, comments, the more of those that we have, the more visibility the podcast has, and the more that we can grow the podcast and network. Now, on to my conversation with Hannah Selin. Well, Hannah, I want to thank you so much for sitting down with me today. I think the last time I saw you was in person during our Chance Encounter at Clarinet Fest last year in Denver, which was really exciting to meet for the first time there. And you've put out a new album since then, which I absolutely love. I'm sure we'll talk about that. And so I'm just really excited to sit down and get to know you a little more. And yeah, just thanks again for being with me today.
Yeah, my pleasure to be here. Can't wait to get into some of this composer stuff with you.
Totally, for sure. So where we like to begin here on Music Maker is as far back as you are willing to share or as far back as you can remember. So my first question is the same for everyone, and that is, what is your earliest artistic memory as a composer? Like that first inkling of like, oh, like I'm meant to make music.
Yeah, I was thinking back to my early memories as a composer, which aren't that early. I started relatively late. I was about 20 when I started writing songs and doing kind of sound collages. And so there are two things that come up. One is I wrote some songs that were kind of mixed meter waltzes that ended up going in loops and loops forever and ever. Kind of these like palindrome or like snake eating their tail sketches that I played with a band that I had in college. And then I also was doing sound collages. So I was going out in rural Ohio where I lived at the time and making field recordings of different nature sounds and then splicing them together in software and using that to create little compositions.
What were those early compositions? I mean, you mentioned like mixed meter and that sort of thing. And then sound collages is kind of its own thing. I mean, what drew you to doing that? Because you, as a performer, you're a violist, right?
Yeah, I go way back as a violist and started composing much later. So yeah, I started the mixed meter songs and waltzy things, and the sound collages were kind of happening simultaneously but separately. And I think that's interesting actually because I've continued over the years to kind of keep songwriting and composing somewhat separate, even though they intertwine a lot in my practice. But yeah, back then I was feeling kind of pinned down by my classical viola studies. I was in a conservatory setting and I was at Oberlin Conservatory in Ohio for my undergrad. And I loved performing and playing, but I just felt squelched, as many conservatory students do, by the extreme requirements and the technical regimen that I was expected to follow. So I started doing these little songs and compositions as a way to get away outside of that box and kind of escape into another world.
So I talk to composers sometimes who, like, I talked to a composer a couple weeks ago who his answer to that question was like, when I was 4 or 5, I which is not my experience in any way, and not yours either. And then other composers who do start like composing what we would consider later, like once they're kind of well into like an undergraduate degree. I mean, how did that evolve from there? And I mean, it sounds like it was kind of separate from your studies a little bit, or did it start to become more integrated in some way?
It started out being separate, but then I started taking some electronic music courses in the last year I was doing my undergraduate. And so I was able to start exploring computer music and synthesizers and just learning the very basics of electronic music during that time. And that kind of led me into composing more as I got out of school. And I took a few years after college to experiment, and I did a lot of programming in Max MSP and created some sound installations that now feel very different from what I'm doing, but at the same time they kind of informed and shaped who I am today.
So like your roots in composition are very much attached to like production and electronic music then.
Yeah, they are. But I also had such a long, like my whole childhood, I was a really devout violist, for lack of a better word. I was very passionate about being a violist, and I still play a lot. So all of those years from age 8 through 20-ish informed what I started to create when I started making songs and electronic music things. And then I didn't really compose acoustic pieces until it was kind of a gradual process, but a few years after that. So, 23, 24, I started writing my first official piece for an acoustic instrument, which was for viola and electronics.
Yeah, I dig it. I mean, what kind of music were you listening to at that time when you were first starting to compose? Because I mean, like I listened to a lot of like bands that did mixed like math rock and progressive metal and that sort of thing when I was in high school, and so mixed meter really resonates with me, and that's why I'm kind of stuck on it because that's always been a part of my musical language and what I've loved. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
what kind of music informed those early compositions?
I was listening to a really bizarre assortment of things. Some of them were from my conservatory studies, so I was kind of getting exposed to early electronic music, like music concrete and Pierre Schaeffer's music. I heard Hildegard Westerkamp's music for the first time and met her when I was an undergrad. So that had an impact. And then I was also really into Radiohead, like
Yeah.
from the end of high school, kind of into college. So I definitely drew some inspiration from their sound. And then I learned that Paul Lansky's piece Mild and Lease was actually sampled in a Radiohead song that I loved. And so all of these kinds of cross genre things started happening. And I also was listening to Tin Hat, I think is the name of the group, one of Carla Kilstedt's projects. And they did a lot of mixed meter kind of folk influenced songs that also had violin and viola in them. So I took some inspiration there, and I was listening to a lot of jazz and Cecil Taylor of all people.
Yeah.
And now I talk to my husband, who's a jazz pianist, and he's like, you were listening to who when you started listening to jazz? And I'm like, yeah, Cecil Taylor. But I loved like just the wildness of hearing his solos and his style at that point.
When would you say your first encounter with a composer was? Was that in your undergrad studies?
Actually, it was in high school. In my senior year of high school, I was in this chamber ensemble with a pianist composer. It was a student group, and we became really good friends there and kind of started hanging out. And it was actually like the start of my very short rebellious phase of high school, which was really only in my senior year. But I started like skipping school and going to hang out with this group of friends, including this composer. And we would like go on aimless road trips and kind of stop at just random points along the highway and see what was there and listen to Radiohead.
Yeah.
So that was really my first encounter with a composer. And I think I also performed a living composer's works in that group, although I don't know if they were at our performances.
That's an interesting thought that it was a group of musicians that led to, and a composer of all people, to lead you to be like skipping school and stuff. That's it's kind of
Yeah,
funny.
it was kind of bizarre. But yeah, I was very like studious for much of my high school time, and then I finally found a few friends that I felt like I could like really kind of go outside of the bounds of my previous existence.
Yeah, I gotcha. So can you kind of connect the dots for us? I mean, you started really composing kind of late into undergrad. What was your creative journey like after that? Like what kind of, I mean, as briefly as you feel like, I mean, what were the steps that have led you to the composer you are today?
Like I mentioned earlier, I started with electronic music. I did these sound collages with field recordings. I still have a lot of those field recordings, and I hope to use them in other pieces. So I went from there to a few years. I lived in Philadelphia for a little while after graduating, and then I moved to New York City a couple years after that. And during that time, I was making sound installations with many channels, and they were kind of oral history inspired. At least the first one was. That was called Sylvania. And I was living in South Philadelphia at that time in, I think, 2013, maybe 2012. And I went around. This is like a different, young, like completely kind of uninhibited version of myself. I went around my neighborhood and just had a little portable recorder and interviewed people, strangers that I met.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it was kind of a rough neighborhood. It was like a real melting pot with a lot of different people from different parts of the world. There were some refugees from Southeast Asia. There was like a heavy Italian population that went really many generations back. And it was also a very poor area, working class. And I went around and talked to people, got their permission to include those recordings in the final piece, and also got their contact information so I could invite them to the installation, which was going to happen in Center City, Philadelphia after that. So I patched together these stories. I broke things down based on common themes. I found that like work was a big topic. So a lot of people ended up talking about what they did for work, how many hours they worked every week. A lot of people were working like 60 or 80 hours a week. And so I kind of like, it ended up going in this working class direction, thinking about the division of our lives and how we parse out our time and survive.
Yeah.
And so I created like a sound forest using clips from all of those interviews and mixed them up with synthesized kind of like processed sine tones. And that became this installation with 18 channels. I've built a kind of very cheap 18 speaker setup using computer speakers and hanging them from the ceiling in this kind of sparse sound forest that you could walk through so that your proximity to the speakers would determine what mix you were hearing in the piece. So yeah, that was early days of before I was composing anything with notation. I was making these kinds of sound forest things. I did another piece after that that used 8 channels and a kind of similar setup, and that was called Incorporate. And I collaborated with a visual artist named Ann Yancha on that one. And we made this kind of magic school bus not inspired, but this idea of going inside the human body. We made this pod thing out of hanging silk paintings and speakers that one person could go inside and be kind of immersed in sound and colors from the silks. And I just took a bunch of little samples, again, of different people speaking and cut them up and put them together into rhythmic patterns that were randomized and also different filtered sine waves and lots of randomized parameters to create this kind of, it was supposed to be an installation that would go on forever, but it ended up dying after like 7.5 minutes. So I thought it was really great because the idea was that, the human body. So the piece itself, like the program that I created to generate the piece, it would just kind of bug out after 7.5 minutes and die. That was the early installation phase. Then I started writing a tiny bit for acoustic instruments. I wrote a solo viola piece called Olfactory Bulbs that was inspired by the connection between the sense of smell and memory and just how evocative smells are. So each movement was a different smell. And that was a piece I composed for my teacher, actually, my viola teacher for many years. And it used live electronics to kind of process the viola and evoke these different smells. There was sage, tar, and there was, snow. So I was kind of imagining the smells, but also the feelings that come with them. Yeah, and from there, I slowly kind of got into more and more different types of instruments. I went away from electronics for a few years just to dig into acoustic instruments because I needed to learn how to write for acoustic instruments. And I also started to get tired of the restrictions of electronic music and the lack of human connection there. I just wanted to be more in the world and among people, among musicians, making music. So that's how I started composing. That's how I started composing, really. It was just by working from, non-human musical material and slowly wanting to get closer and closer to people until eventually I made my way back to instruments.
It's so interesting to hear you describe electronic music as restricting from my perspective, because I was the exact opposite. I wrote for acoustic instruments. I didn't even know like electroacoustic music was. I mean, I probably knew, but I didn't know like the breadth of that world until I got to grad school and started taking classes. And to me, that like being able to work in a DAW with synthesizers and like found sound and music concrete and all that kind of stuff felt super liberating to me. So it's really interesting, like you had the opposite experience in many ways.
I mean, I still feel like it's really liberating, and there's so much potential, obviously, with technology and electronic music. But for me, because I was a performer at heart and I was still, all that time, I was still playing a lot
Yeah,
as a violist and starting to sing too. I think I just felt like I needed a more direct connection to the material I was writing. And for me, that meant, instruments in some way.
sure. So what prompted you to finally start composing concert works? I mean, you kind of talked about why you dived into it and really focused on it, but like was it a commission? Was it just like you just wanted to?
Good question. I guess that solo viola piece was kind of a commission, more like my viola teacher wanting to encourage me to compose more. Like right when I was graduating, she asked me to write a piece for her. And so that was my first acoustic composition. And I guess I was kind of maybe working on it at the same time as those installations. But it took me like a few years to actually, after that viola piece, it took me a few years to start getting commissions and having opportunities to compose for professional musicians. So there were a few years where I was just writing for friends and kind of doing small projects that didn't usually pan out. And then I was also studying. So that's another thing. I was in grad school
Yeah.
I took a few years off, and then I was in grad school for a few years at Brooklyn College, and really just kind of like learning a lot of nuts and bolts about acoustic composition, and still doing some electroacoustic stuff as well, and experimenting more with recording myself, and making kind of multi-layered pieces with viola voice and other found sounds.
So when and what would you say was the defining moment where you knew that you wanted to pursue your craft as a career?
I don't think there was a particular moment. I mean, I feel like for me, being a violist for all of these years, I always knew I was going to become a musician. And the way I look at composing is as a musician. I don't like to separate so much between being a performer
Mm,
and being a composer. And I like that that's a little bit more welcome these days, I think, in the new music world, to do both things. But I can't say there was one moment. It's really all of these little moments of creating things over the years that led to gradually becoming a person who puts different sounds together and realizing that, that is my calling, and that's really what I I can do best, and the best way for me to express myself. Yeah. I don't feel like I'm able to get as much across in words, although I'm trying today.
I understand and I appreciate it, and I think there's something to be said for like the intuitive nature of our paths. I mean, a lot of times it's like I'll look back and I can see like the decisions that I made that led me to today. But in those moments, like it was like you're not thinking about that, right? Like I never, 10 years ago when I was doing like classical music radio, I never thought I'd be hosting a podcast like this, for example. You know what I mean? So no, I can totally see where you're coming from, and I can appreciate it as well. So we've talked a lot about like your work in electronic music, and you kind of answered my question for me already, because I'm always interested to know like when and how composers who work within electroacoustic modes first begin doing that, because like I've said, for me it was like such an eye-opening like asteroid hitting Earth moment for me, like universe exploding kind of thing. I'm being really dramatic. I don't know why, but
I love that.
yeah. But I guess with what you've already said, I mean, when did you first encounter electronic music, maybe as a listener, and what drew you into that world? I mean, it sounds like it drew you deep in, if that was like your first moments as a composer.
hmm Yeah, I'm not sure exactly. I I'm thinking Radiohead, even though that's not really electronic music, but some of the types of processing and the effects that they used, for me as this weird high school kid who had only really been doing classical music pretty intensely for most of my life from the age of 8 to like 18, when I finally started listening to other kinds of music more, and that was at first that was like a lot of Radiohead. It was just like so amazing to hear all of these crazy like stuttering effects, delays and filtering and reverbs and like looping and all kinds of and synthesizers, and I loved that sound world. I didn't really know how it was done, and I didn't know how bands worked either, but I just loved the kind of blend of acoustic and electronic sounds that I heard there in that like rock music context. So that was really the first place. And then when I was in college, I heard like a lot of the seminal electronic music pieces, and I loved them.
Mm.
So like some that stand out are like Williams Mix by John Cage. That one is so cool. And just the idea of randomization and the possibilities of having multiple channels of sound, I really took so much from that piece and brought it into my early electronic music compositions.
So you were talking about sound installations earlier, and I didn't intend to ask you about sound installations because I know you as like a concert composer. um, but can you kind of talk about, for those who might be listening who maybe have never experienced a sound installation, can you talk a little bit about what that is? And also, for you as a composer, how does your process differ from composing for a sound installation versus composing for, well, certainly a human being, but also like a stage composition, so to speak?
Well, okay, what a sound installation is, it can be so many things. So I can really only speak from my own experience and what I've created, and some that I've seen a few sound installations in museums also. But I'll just talk through the one I mentioned earlier, Sylvania, which was the sound forest. And actually the title Sylvania relates to trees, Sylvan, and also Pennsylvania, which is the state that I grew up in. So for that piece, that was my first installation out of really only two. But I was really figuring it out as I went. And for this piece, building a structure that could house all of these speakers. If you're lucky and you have more experience and you have access to nice venues, which I didn't at the time, you can get amazing arrays of, hundreds of speakers to have almost infinite possibilities and many, many channels of sound. For me at that time in my life, I was really just taking this DIY approach. And maybe that's something I do in general, sometimes for the best, sometimes for the worst, trying to build things from scratch when maybe I don't always need to, but something about the process is always inspiring. And I still do those things today where I could take something that already exists and use it, but I just redo it for the
Yeah.
sake of learning how it works. And so, yeah, sound installation can be many things, but a lot of the time it involves having multiple channels of sound. So not just two, which we're used to when we have headphones or speakers. We live in a still pretty stereo world, even though I guess a lot of people have like surround sound systems at home, which is nice. Or the movie theater, you'll hear 5.1 surround sound, which is like 5 separate channels of sound. So a sound installation just kind of plays around with the many possibilities of having spatialized sound through multiple speakers. It can also involve sounds that wouldn't necessarily be considered music. So yeah, it's kind of sound installation, sound art are this tangential area that kind of lies next to music, but also crosses over into other parts of society and other art forms.
Right. Yeah.
And I haven't been making them for a long time, but I think it's really fun. And at that point in my life, I just loved like experimenting with things, and I had to get my dad involved to like come in and assemble, like saw off pieces of PVC pipe and like use zip ties to like assemble them together and tenuously hang all of these cheap computer speakers at different heights from this suspended frame. It was pretty extreme, actually, looking back on it, like the amount of energy that went into that installation, but it was fun.
I love that. So, something you say on your website is you talk about, and I think this is totally related to what you're saying. You talk about sounds almost like they're living organisms, saying that your music delves into the inner lives of sounds. And I love this because to me, like this communicates like a lot of love for sound, like different sounds. And so, what kind of led you to think about sound in this way, and how do you explore sound in your pieces that you make?
It goes back, I think, to again to those like electronic music experiments at the very beginning of when I was started to compose, and taking field recordings and kind of picking them apart with computers or synthesizers and like running just sounds from nature through weird filters and weird patches on old synthesizers in my college basement, and hearing the result of that processing. So when I'm talking about the inner lives of sounds, I guess I'm thinking about all the details that we can't hear in just our daily lives. We pass through so many sounds. I mean, every instant has its own sounds, and we're not able to process all of that information. We just hear what is useful for us. So composing for me, I think involves like really slowing down and trying to really live inside of the sonorities that we already have around us, and also that exist in, instruments around us and things like that. So I think more than anything, the inner lives of sounds in my process means taking recordings and slowing them down and processing them and like really studying them, and then using that as an iterative process where through repetition you can hear new details in a recording, and then you can create something from that and record it and then listen again and hear something new.
Do you think it's possible to explore that in strictly acoustic music or with instruments?
I think it is. I feel like I'm mostly these days I'm doing it in electroacoustic pieces, I guess. But pretty much all of my pieces, including the ones that are only acoustic, use processes like that in some way, where there's like an idea and a sound, and I then kind of pry that sound apart and transcribe it or take different aspects of it and give those to different instruments.
So, I mean, what you're describing brings to mind like some of my favorite like albums, for example, and we're talking like non-classical music, but certainly some of my favorite compositions do this too, where you listen to it and like you take it in the first time, but it is like the repeat listens where you discover those little details that you didn't catch the first time, and it's the same piece or it's the same collection of songs or music or what have you. And but like I just like when I have those aha moments time and time again, that's what really drives home like, oh, this is like really excellent stuff. I mean, do you feel like your music is doing that, or is it more like a process, like you are doing that through recordings and then kind of whittling it away, and then you end up with like a final product for people?
I hope that my music is doing that.
Yeah.
Yeah, like I want it to have a life of its own. And obviously every piece that we create will have a life of its own and after it's created, and we don't really, it's no longer our thing. At least that's how I feel about it. Once I create a piece of music, it's kind of its own organism in the music universe. But yeah, and I try to, like, I want to create music that kind of like where there are many different parts that kind of pull against each other and intermingle and then transform each other, and that the listener is able to feel that process. So that's my goal.
That's great. I wasn't sure if it was only process or if it's like the intended outcome as well, because those can be like two very different things, or they could be the same thing, I suppose. I'm thinking out loud here. So.
No, I think they're different things, but I hope that my music inhabits both of those categories.
For sure. What would you describe as the primary pillars of your creative process? And I ask this question of everyone, and every time I ask it, it's kind of like you've probably been hinting at it by now, but just in a more direct way, what would you say those things or that thing might be?
So the pillars I would say are the voice and also instruments, but I feel like all instruments in some way are just kind of like everything goes back to the voice. Instruments have their own voices. So thinking about the texture, the timbre, all aspects, the rhythm of the voice, and trying to bring that into whatever kind of music it is, even if there is no voice in it. I wrote a lot of vocal music, but also music without voice. Kind of deconstructed sounds and reconstructed sounds. So like real world sounds, field recordings, processing them in a computer and then taking them out again, and kind of like using technology in the process, but not always in the final composition. So there's this like transformation that happens between sounds, technology, listening back. Nature is also a big inspiration for me. So how that relates to music, I guess, varies a lot from one piece to the next, but I feel like in all of my composing, I'm usually like there's some image or feeling that I'm going off of, and that comes from a place I've been or lived. And textures, I love different musical textures, and I play around with them a lot, and sometimes that overlaps between electronic and acoustic music. Like sometimes I take electronic effects and kind of try them in an acoustic setting and vice versa. And I use graphic scores a lot. So like kind of visual inspiration, shapes, lines. I'm not really a visual artist, but I love to use visuals to kind of guide the compositional process. And then finally, literature and poetry. I kind of double majored as an undergrad in literature, and then neglected that major while I focused on music the rest of the time. But I still write a lot of music that has like a lot of vocal music that's based on poems or like short stories. Right now I'm working on a piece based on one of Italo Calvino's Cosmic Comics.
Oh, yeah.
And yeah, I've said a lot of poetry, and I just love like the world of fiction and poetry, and find so much inspiration there that I bring into my music.
You bringing up Italo Calvino might have just added another like half an hour to our conversation, because that he has been like, his work has been such a huge point of inspiration for me too, including some of his Cosmic Comics and his Invisible Cities, and even like his 6 memos for the next millennium. That was such like a he's talking about literature, but he's talking about it in such a, I think, a musical way, or a way that can be applied to other art forms, right?
Totally.
So maybe we can talk more about that and a little later on.
That sounds great.
Because I'm very interested in it. But you said this thing about deconstruction leading to reconstruction, and you're also talking about how nature is an inspiration of yours. And I can't help but feel like that's all somehow connected in some way, because, you know, when we look at natural processes, that's kind of what it is. It's all about like things grow and bloom and have a life cycle, and then they decay and return to the earth. And I'm being a little more poetic than I have any right to be on this podcast, but I don't know. I think that's a very interesting viewpoint, and I just wanted to ask you more about that.
I mean, I guess the way I've come to see composing and kind of just human art making in general is as a natural process, just the way other things grow and live their lives and we live our lives. We make these things and then leave like traces behind us in the form of art and, you know, infrastructure, pollution, whatever things that we leave behind as humans. I've I guess been thinking a lot about these things because I was working on my dissertation and having to get into like the whole endless question, what is nature? What are humans? Is there any divide or distinction between the two? And the short answer is I don't think there is a distinction, but in music, yeah, I see it as this thing that grows out of us, and that doesn't mean that it's easy always to write music. Sometimes it's like a painful process, but I had a baby recently, and that was also a painful process. But sometimes these kinds of events need the struggle kind of to get that thing out there in the world. But in terms of deconstruction and reconstruction on a more specific or like granular level, I like to, when I'm composing, both work with, I guess I talked about this earlier, but a kind of iterative process where I'll like have a piece of source material, whether it's a field recording or a harmony that I really like. I'll take that, I'll record something, you know, a harmony on the piano, for example, and then take that recording and like process it and slow it down and do other things to it in the computer and listen back to that, and then kind of extend my ears with technology and then take those findings and bring them back into some part of the composition. Sometimes it's like a very important part of the piece, and sometimes it ends up being kind of tangential. But yeah, I started using this process with specifically like harmonies that I played on the piano. Actually, this is something that I think gets into another question that you might ask me later, so I'm not going to go all the way into it. But sure. It's like a technique that I like to use that I'd love to tell people about. But I can talk more about that maybe when we get to that point.
Sure. I mean, what we touched on what you were describing a little bit earlier, and I had this thought kind of flash through my mind, and I didn't get it out, and now we're talking about it again. So I guess I'll use this as an opportunity to ask you like about this, how you take recordings. I mean, is it fair to say that it's almost like you're orchestrating these findings that you make through technology? I mean, it reminds me a lot of like spectral composers who take like the frequencies of, I'm thinking of the Grisey piece where he orchestrates like a bass trombone note in the whole orchestra, right? Which was one of those things that was like, oh, I could be doing that.
Yeah, I was actually going to mention that earlier as like one of my inspirations. Definitely, I learned a lot from understanding how spectralists created pieces like that. And yeah, I'm definitely kind of thinking about those processes when I work with recordings in this way, but the way I'm doing it is much more like intuitive and kind of like the way you might transcribe. I'm not a jazz musician, but I've tried to study jazz and like learn solos, like other people's solos. So that idea of just like transcribing by ear, taking that kind of approach to like slowed down field recordings or slowed down musical recordings, and then, like you said, orchestrating from that experience of the processed recording.
Yeah, because I mean, you could orchestrate the harmonic frequencies of a particular sound, which has been done. There's lots of pieces that have done that through
Mm-hmm.
spectral music. But I almost imagine like I'm thinking of a slowed down piano chord, and like I'm sure rhythms start to come out and different like microtones. I mean, that's spectralism, but
Yeah. Yeah, no, definitely. That's one of the things that I love to do, that I would like encourage anyone who's trying to get into composing or just curious about sound and music to experiment with that.
yeah, you just casually mentioned your dissertation for your PhD, which is something I had a question about. So I'll go ahead and jump right into this.
No.
Well, so I was doing this deep dive on your website, as I do with all of my guests, and kind of looking for things to talk about. And on your CV, you list your PhD dissertation as being about biocentric composition techniques. I don't even know what this means. So
Don't worry, nobody does, because I came up with the term in the process of writing the dissertation. So I don't blame you, but I had to like squeeze it into like a few words,
yeah.
which is why it sounds like that. Although I would prefer something a little bit more understandable. But yeah, basically it just means music that deals with nature and, composition techniques that incorporate the natural world in some way.
So how does this manifest in your work? I mean, is this what we've been talking about, or is this like another level
This
deeper?
is it relates to the series of pieces called Pieces of Place. That is something that I'm working on still. It's kind of an ongoing project. And also, yeah, it's a little bit more specific in my mind than most of the pieces that I've talked about so far. In like the last 5 years, I've done more composing that I consider to be biocentric, where I'm like actively involving sounds or phenomena or other entities from the natural world in my music in some way. So yeah, that's what biocentric music is. I it can be. I'll explain a little bit further. I mean, it's a pretty broad definition. Biocentric music can be like any music that engages actively with nature. That's how I see it, at least. And that includes a lot of different styles of music and a lot of, I think, musical traditions around the world. And that wasn't my dissertation topic. I'm specifically focused on composition techniques that are biocentric, but I think music has a lot of potential to be biocentric.
Are these techniques that we are all maybe already using, or are they like newly, like, are you conceptualizing these techniques? What are they?
Great question.
Yeah.
Well, okay, so the short answer is that yeah, they are techniques that are already being used, and I ended up, because it is so difficult to say this is a biocentric technique and this is not, I ended up just doing case studies. So my dissertation focuses on two composers and then also on my own work in the Pieces of Place compositions. So I talk about Hildegard Westerkamp's soundscape composition. I talk about John Luther Adams' Become trilogy, Become Ocean, Become Desert, and Become River. And I also meant to talk about Tristan Murray's The Partage des Eaux, which is a big orchestral piece, a spectral piece, but I didn't have time to write that chapter. So hopefully that will be in the future. But yeah, biocentric techniques can involve anything from like field recording, making soundscape compositions with field recordings, data sonification, and you can do those things and kind of ignore the source material. But I guess part of my argument is that it's important to honor whatever natural source you're using in your music. It's important to make that a part of the music, and that's what distinguishes biocentric music from other music, is that this kind of honoring of the source material and the connection with whatever aspects of nature are present in the music.
I mean, is this sort of, I hesitate to use the word activism, but I know of so many pieces that kind of are in response to the climate crisis, for example, which I think would be a form of activism. I mean, I'm sure that this could be, the biocentricity. I'm sure that could be applied in many different ways. Like if I just, I really like the way like a stream flows, I'm sure that,
Yeah.
but I mean, is this kind of tangential to like your way of processing like what our natural world is going through? Or is that a stretch or inappropriate for me to ask in any way?
Not at all. That's definitely an important aspect of it. And that's why I started this whole project, the Pieces of Place series, was because I wanted to have some kind of musical response to climate change and global warming. And then in the process of doing those compositions, I started to kind of, I don't know, I don't want to be a downer, but I started to kind of like lose a little bit of hope in the possibilities for concert music that's played in concert halls to have any like serious impact on environmental issues or political issues outside of the concert hall. I do think it's possible, but I think it's more limited than we would hope in
Yeah.
many situations and in my experience. And so I kind of pivoted to this more open-ended, like exploratory approach with my compositions and with biocentric music and studying kind of other composers' approaches to using nature in their music. Not because I think it's important to consider the activist possibilities of music, but I decided to just focus on like the compositional methods for using the natural world in music. And then like political and activist goals, I think, have to be worked in outside of the music, if that makes
Yeah.
sense, in the way that people bring their music into the world and engage with audiences. Yeah.
Yeah, I've complained about this on the podcast before, and I say complain, that makes it maybe seem a little bit more harsh than it actually is. But there's a lot of people who make great music, and again, I've said this before. There's nothing wrong with doing this, but a lot of times it just feels like it's just any old piece of music that had like a title and program notes have been applied to, and so when you said specifically like data sonification, like that seems like a very real way of like bringing these issues to life through music. But I agree with you that music alone probably isn't gonna do the trick. I mean, you have to talk to people.
Yeah, and then also maybe like science alone isn't going to do the trick either, because data sonification is used by like NASA to, when we like heard I can't remember what astronomical event it was. There was like a star that collapsed, some important thing that was recorded by equipment on Earth, and I wish I remembered the actual phenomenon that happened. It was some major astronomical event that was recorded, and then if you looked at all of these like news articles, they were like, finally we can hear a star collapsing. I might be wrong, in audio form, and
Yeah.
actually it's just like whoop, because
Yeah.
it's like it's data sonification. It's not, there's no way to actually hear that across space like this. But I think music has the potential to meaningfully sonify data. So the question is always, how do you make meaning from just pure data or information? And that's what my project has been in Pieces of Place.
Well, yeah, I was going to ask you more about Pieces of Place because you describe it so beautifully on your website. It's this ongoing series for chamber ensembles with or without electronics that is the intersection of geology, ecology, and personal memories. So, was it this kind of concern that led you to start this series of pieces? I mean, kind of walk us through how you created this, how these different techniques that we're talking about, how that manifests in Pieces of Place. So can you just kind of give us a quick deep dive into this?
So yeah, I started these pieces I think in 2020. So important to know, it was like right at the start of the pandemic. And what I've realized since then is that these pieces actually have a lot to do with my own inner turmoil, having to do with being stuck in my apartment for a long time in New York City and missing nature. And so although that's not what I have written in the description, I think a lot of the process of these pieces is kind of me grappling with this sense of loss or absence in my life as an urban dweller who lives in an apartment where my view is like a bunch of other apartments on the other side of my courtyard. I can see a little bit of the sky, and there are like a few trees in the courtyard, but mostly it's like bricks and other people's lives.
Yeah.
And so Pieces of Place, I was trying to think of how to, like I was just saying, how to like make meaning out of gigantic phenomena like global warming or related processes like sea level rise or other kinds of environmental issues, pollution of different sorts. So each Piece of Place is based in a different place that I've lived, and kind of my solution to this question of how to like grapple with these giant issues that stretch way beyond our lives and our communities and beyond like any amount of time and space that we can really perceive. I wanted to make music that could kind of condense some of these many different processes, geological, ecological, and biological processes down into a human-sized musical experience. And the way to do that for me was to kind of connect with places that I know really well and to learn more about those places and think about what animals, what plants live there, what people have lived there in the past, what things might live there in the future, and what are some of the sounds that I associate with that place, and how do those relate with like ancient geological history, if at all? How do those sounds relate to like the biosphere there? Like what animals and insects are involved in making those sounds, or why do those sounds seem to harbor specific kinds of animals? So yeah, each piece is really, really different. And the way it's gone is that because the pieces they're all separate entities, they're not meant to have musical crossover, really, even though I end up, sharing techniques between the pieces. Each one is pretty different. And from the first one to now, I've learned to really try to focus in on at least just like one main concept for each place, because the first piece, which was called Pieces of Place Chesapeake, I tried to do what I'm describing on my website, which is like layering geological time frames with ecological events and like personal time frames. So I had all of these. I had this extremely dense, complicated like series of superimposed timelines that I tried to use to create the form of the piece. And it worked. I was able to do it, but it was really, really difficult to compose that first Piece of Place because I imposed so much information and like observations I made, I transcribed bird calls, and I had like way too much information. And so then in future Pieces of Place Catskills is what I wrote after Chesapeake. For that one, I had a really different approach, which was much more like intuitive. And I focused on a single process, the process of displacement, and thought about it in different contexts, like as it related to the boreal forests at the tops of the Catskill Mountains, which are slowly getting like pushed off because of rising temperatures. Trees from the lower elevations are gradually moving up and kind of slowly erasing these pine tree heavy forests at the tops of the mountains, which are shrinking and might disappear soon. So I was thinking about that process, but also humans being displaced and like the kinds of movements that happened during the pandemic, where a lot of people who could afford to get out of New York City left the city. Myself and like a lot of people in my neighborhood stayed around. And so you saw these really different pictures in different parts of the city during the pandemic. Like in Manhattan, there were a lot of areas that were totally deserted and empty, but like out in the further out parts of the city and the boroughs in Brooklyn, where I live, like things were still kind of active and people mostly stayed around. So I was thinking about both of those different displacements in that piece. And then musically, instead of doing data sonification, which was what I did in Chesapeake, I was more thinking like in more traditional musical terms of like different harmonies blending and tearing apart, and kind of following like a refrain through the whole piece that unfolds really slowly. There's just one melody that goes through the whole piece, but then the surroundings are constantly changing in terms of the harmonic backdrop and like the way the harmonies fit together and fade in and out.
Yeah. I'm really interested in hearing more about what you view the connection is between, geology and ecology, like these big time sort of sciences, with personal memory. And I mean, you talked about the first piece and how like you almost tried to scale it. I mean, like you individually and all of us individually, like our lives are so small, like it's incomprehensible, like how small our lives are compared to like the earth, right? So like, how do you balance these things? I mean, how does one do that?
Right. Well, it's hard. I mean, like I said, in Chesapeake, I felt like it was really out of control. It just took me forever and ever to come up with the right musical material and to try to like imagine these different timelines. There was like, I was thinking about this giant meteor impact that happened that created the Chesapeake Bay like 10 million years ago. And how do you do it? I guess it's an ongoing question for me. I think each piece of place finds a new way to kind of integrate the present moment and what's happened, like how did we get here geologically, how did we get here ecologically, who are we like as people, and trying to find a musical thread that can kind of come out of all of that.
You were talking earlier about in your undergrad being in rural Ohio, and also your time growing up in Pennsylvania and like being connected to nature in that way. And the contrast between that and now you live in a very urban environment, right?
Yeah.
So are all the pieces of place, are they situated in nature? I mean, like Chesapeake Bay and the Catskills, obviously. Are the other ones also kind of along that line?
Those two are the only ones that are finished, and then there's another that I'm starting right now, and that one's based on the time I worked at a summer camp in college for 3 summers in the Rocky Mountains. And so like I said, I think backstory for these pieces is my own relationship with nature and feeling distant from it as a city dweller. But I do have plans to write, pieces of place New York. So there are the pieces of place, and then there are intervening movements called tributaries that are like bodies of water that connect between different pieces of place. So I'm writing tributaries, the Hudson River tributary that connects the Catskills down to New York City. And then I have to write pieces of place New York City, which I've been avoiding because I don't know where to begin. There's just so much to it. There's so much chaos and so many sounds. But the plan is to have, try to represent both rural and urban, and I guess also suburban places, because I've lived in all of those different places.
Yeah. So how have audiences responded to these pieces? I mean, because I imagine, we all kind of have this story of interacting with the world around us. And again, like as individuals, we're so small compared to the broader world and the existence of everything. So I'm sure that this is proven to be like a great opportunity, like we discussed earlier, to kind of present these ideas to people. Have they responded well to those?
I think so. There haven't been a lot of, Pieces of Place Chesapeake has been performed a few times, and generally, to positive feelings in the audience. Pieces of Place Catskills really has only been performed once, and that was like in an academic setting. So I can't wait for it to actually be performed in a real life place. But yeah, in particular with Pieces of Place Catskills, like the one time that one was performed, people had a lot of positive feedback, like just feeling like they could feel that the displacement happening over the course of the piece. And I guess similar with Pieces of Place Chesapeake, there was one, I remember one composer who was like, this sounds like the Moldau Suite by Smetana. And so there was that. There's like it's aquatic. It has this watery aspect. But then other listeners said they could feel like this sense of it getting submerged at the end, which is what I hoped, which is, this idea of what will happen in like 1,000 years if the sea level rise is so dramatic that it covers up the place I know that is currently above like dry land.
Right, exactly.
So I hope that, I really hope they can get out there and have more of a life in the world as pieces, because Chesapeake has been out a bit in the world, but Catskills is still waiting for its moment.
So you mentioned these are with or without electronics. What kind of consideration do you give to deciding what features electronics, for example?
In general, like in my music?
Well, I guess in Pieces of Place, but also, I guess more broadly in all of your music.
Yeah, deciding whether or not to use electronics is always like a practical consideration for each piece and partly aesthetic. And, it depends on the project. With the Pieces of Place, I'm generally using electronics in some way in all of the Pieces of Place. I'm not using them so much in the tributaries, which are these like smaller connecting movements for one or two instruments. And then in my music kind of at large, outside of the Pieces of Place series, the question of whether or not to use electronics is usually decided by the person who commissions it. So, and sometimes there's like a back and forth, like a lot of the time, actually. Like someone will ask me to write a piece of music and they'll say, I really love this stuff with electronics. Can you do that? And then we'll have a conversation about it. And then sometimes the piece, as I'm starting it, I realize it doesn't need electronics or doesn't want them. And then I'll have that conversation. And usually it's fine. And other times I have an acoustic piece and then I'm like, oh, actually, it'd be really cool if it had this like effect on it. And usually that's possible to add, but it depends on, the performance setting.
Yeah, I find that like, well, I don't think I've written a piece with electronics in almost 10 years, which I think more and more about these days. Like, it's like something I love to do. But yeah, it's like the opportunity hasn't come up, and it's like, I do wish that like, and you just said it. I mean, like you can get into the process of writing a piece and make that decision and have that conversation. Me personally, I've never thought to do that. So thank you for that.
Yeah, it's a great thing to do. I mean, I feel like I have the opposite problem a lot of the time where people think of me as someone who uses electronics. And then I actually sometimes like I was saying earlier, like I want to move away from electronics into acoustic instruments more. Yeah, I'm always it's always a dynamic process. Like I feel like from one piece to the next or 1 year to the next, I have more or less desire to use technology in my music. And I always try to keep it, I guess I always try to keep enough not separation, but I try to leave plenty of space for the acoustic instruments to be themselves outside of the electronics, because I just think it's more exciting that way when the performer is like using their voice as a musician and the electronics are supporting that rather than like kind of dictating how things happen.
Yeah, I mentioned your album earlier, like right at the top of this conversation. And I think especially your piece of Dream Journal for Chromic Duo, I mean, like what you're talking about, this balance, like you do so wonderfully in that piece. I just love that piece. So
Yay. Okay, I do too. Yeah, it's like kind of that's another like pandemic piece that was like an ode to imaginary worlds that are possible even when we're kind of in our mundane, normal day-to-day boxes.
Tyler here, interrupting this conversation just briefly to let you know that you can easily help power the Music Maker podcast and Loose Leaf Transmissions Network in a big time way by becoming a Patreon subscriber. By becoming a Patreon subscriber, you're supporting these fantastic conversations with makers in a real way. And one of the perks to being a subscriber is getting early access to episodes each week. And I've also launched a Patreon exclusive feature called The Workshop. It's sort of like an audio journal where I share a little bit about my own creative process as it pertains to some current composition projects that I'm working on. Anyway, yes, that little bit of support on the Patreon, in fact, does go a long way in helping me cover the cost of some tools that I use to produce this podcast. So I hope you'll consider becoming a subscriber by following the Patreon link in the show description of this episode, or you can log on to looseleaftransmissions.com/support. I really appreciate you getting back to me. And back to today's episode. So shifting gears a bit to a question that I ask everyone, and that is, what is a piece of music, a song, a book, a piece of art, any kind of artistic artifact, I suppose you could say, anything like that, or even like an experience or a place that has changed the way that you thought about your work, maybe changed your life, or that you keep coming back to as like a touchstone in your creative practice?
There are a lot of different pieces of music that I keep coming back to. I don't want to list them all, but some of the top ones are the Chick Corea song 500 Miles High. I love that one, and I learned it a while ago and sang it with my band a few times. And I already mentioned John Cage's Williams mix, but yeah, this is another piece that has had a big impact on me. Just thinking about like spatialized audio and randomization and the use of field recordings and kind of juxtaposing urban and rural or kind of wilderness natural sounds. And let's see. Yeah, and I also, there are a lot of experiences I've had, especially out in different natural places that I know that have just stuck with me over the years and made their way into my music in different ways. The Catskills, there's a mountain there that I've climbed many times called Mount Wittenberg, and I've been up it for a while. It was pretty much every year I would make kind of like a pilgrimage up that mountain, and I've seen myself at many different stages of life in that place and kind of observed how I've changed, how the place has changed and changes over the seasons. But yeah, I go up there because I have family in that area, and there's kind of a many generations of people moving between New York City and the Catskills, and I'm happen to be in New York City, but various different relatives are up there, and it's a nice place to visit when you live in the city. But I once did a silent hike up Mount Wittenberg with a really good friend of mine, and we just didn't talk the entire time until we got to the top, and we stopped periodically to write down just anything that was going through our minds. And I think I also at that point was into like sound journaling, and so I was taking note of different sounds I heard and each point along the way. And yeah, that's one place. There's another like kind of image that's stuck in my head that I'm going to be hopefully incorporating into a piece next year, also in the Pieces of Place series. I don't think I mentioned that, but Mount Wittenberg is kind of the inspiration for Pieces of Place Catskills, which is one of the two pieces I've composed so far in that series. And then this year I'm going to be writing a piece for Splice Ensemble that's also in the series, Pieces of Place. And this one is called Rockies. It's based on the Rocky Mountains, where I worked through college as a summer camp cook. And that's a whole other side note. But yeah, I kept going back to this really pretty terrible summer job because it was in such a beautiful place. And I just loved the place so much that I was willing to somehow I was able to forget about the hardships and the low pay. And then I just went back every summer through college. And in that place, I would wander around. This was a summer camp high up in the Rocky Mountains in Colorado at like 9,500 feet elevation. And I did a lot of things. I was very, eccentric at that point in my life. Not that I've become less so, but at that point I had more freedom to just wander around, and I did that a lot. And I would sometimes bring, I think I had a portable audio recorder, but I can't find my field recordings from that time. But there was just one experience when I was out wandering and I got a bit lost. I ended up on like this abandoned ranch, and it was just kind of eerie because, I was alone. There was no sign of any other humans there, but there was this like pasture and kind of overgrown house and like shed thing. And just all of it was like framed by the mountains and forests and really tall fields of grass. And as soon as I got out of the woods and like happened upon this pasture, I saw on the opposite hill a flock of elk. And they just, at that moment, there was just this incredible synchronicity where they all turned their heads at the same time and the same speed and the same angle and everything. They just stopped what they were doing. They turned in complete synchrony and looked at me. And then there was this kind of like timeless moment where we were all looking at each other. And then the next moment, they all started to run also at the same exact time. And then they were gone. And that image and feeling of kind of encountering these other living things, and we don't understand each other, but we're still able to make eye contact and sense each other's presence in a very intense way. That feeling has stuck with me ever since then, and I'm excited to incorporate it into a piece of music, although I don't know how yet.
Well, I was gonna say that, like, I mean, it's easy to say this because this is like a music or arts podcast, but like the way you describe that is so musical, like the pacing of it, and it's like a moment by moment event kind of like, I don't know, it's like I could totally see that being like a piece of music.
Yeah, I'm trying to figure out, like, and this is like with every piece of place, I'm trying to figure out like what that's the one thing I have figured it out, that I'm focusing on that moment,
Yeah.
among all the other like interesting things I encountered there, but I don't know yet how it'll take shape musically, and that's the fun part, I guess.
Yeah, right. I am struck by the way you've described Mountain Wittenberg in particular. I mean, it seems like you are so conscious of this place and what it's meant in your life to be able to like continue to go there and actively think about how like it's changing, and like you've been doing this for years, and like you're a different person every time you go back, and like all this kind of stuff. I mean, that really does seem like an artistic approach to experiencing place, I think.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of just, I don't think of it as an artistic process really, but
Sure, yeah.
it's like a personal thing, and I think we all have places like that are meaningful to us, that kind of serve as like a mirror that reflects us back to ourselves over as time passes, that at the same time, has its own life outside of our own lives that we can get to know. And likewise, we can kind of go back there and observe what's changing about that place.
Yeah, I love that. So earlier you mentioned that you're working on a piece inspired by Calvino's Cosmicomics, and I got really excited when you mentioned it, and that's because I would rank Calvino as maybe my top two or three favorite authors of all time. Like he's just like, his work has been so influential for me artistically, and just keep coming back to it. And it's almost like Mount Wittenberg in a way for me. Like I'll just come back to it like years later and like glean like totally new things from it. And that's why I got excited when you mentioned him. So I'm really interested to hear how his work has resonated with you, and if you don't mind talking about it, like what specifically you're drawing from it, I guess for this particular piece, but just in general.
So I also would, I rank Calvino pretty high up there among my favorite authors. I haven't thought about who my top 10 are in a long time. But he's in the top 10. And yeah, so this is a story from the Cosmic Comics called The Soft Moon. And I don't know when I started reading Cosmic Comics. I got the book like, I don't know, a decade ago and kind of read different stories from it here and there. And this one just really struck me because of the way it makes fun of human civilization and our approach to science, our hubris in thinking we know how everything works and we can control our environment. I guess, yeah, I've also read a bunch of his other works like Invisible Cities and If on a Winter's Night a Traveler.
Oh, so
and
good.
I need to go back to them. It's been a while, actually. Like you mentioned, I would definitely like to go back and see how they strike me now, because it's been a long time. But yeah, his work is just so exciting. So it has so much in it that could be musical, but at the same time, it's challenging. Like I'm learning as I'm trying to work on this piece that, well, I'm learning how to, first of all, eventually make a libretto, but I haven't even gotten to that point yet because I'm just getting to know the story and how it will break down. I've met with a dramaturg once, and hopefully I will again, because it's my first time working on an opera or something in that world, and I'm just every step of the way realizing that I need help, and I need to figure out like how these things work. How do you convert narrative, like a work of fiction, into a musical piece, and also maintain the narrative structure. So yeah, so The Soft Moon, I can tell you a little bit about the story, and then I'll kind of quickly go over what I'm imagining for the piece. The story is, all of the stories in the Cosmic Comics are narrated by this guy named It's QFWFQ is his name.
Right.
And fortunately, that won't be one of the lyrics, because it could be fun actually to make all of those sounds, but without any vowels, it's a little challenging. Actually, that gives me some ideas for maybe like the instruments could make the sounds of those consonants.
It's like a very I imagine like a crash cymbal, almost like
that
kind of a sound. Anyway,
like a serious flam where everyone hits slightly at a slightly different moment with a percussive sound. So the narrator in this story, he takes on a different guise in every story, and I also recently realized that it seems like he has a different like romantic interest or partner in every story, which I didn't think about this before, but it is a very like nice thing if you're if you're a male author and you're writing this book. It's like, oh, I'm just gonna put myself in all these stories and I'm gonna get to hook up with all of these ladies in all of these different contexts, like throughout the universe since the Big Bang. That's a pretty epic tale for the narrator. But anyhow, so in this one, his partner is named Sybil, and she's a scientist. She works at the observatory. And the story starts off with the narrator just talking about how the moon something is off with the moon. Something's going on. It looks like it might be transforming. It's getting closer to the Earth. And yeah, he talks about how the Earth is now covered in all of these beautiful synthetic materials that are, the things among which we were born and bred. So the planet has basically, humans have converted it into this completely synthetic thing, with the whole crust of the planet is made out of like plastic and glass and metal and vinyl. He has a whole list of like all of the 20th century materials that humans invented and have been using ever since, and continuing to develop for better and for worse. So he's just kind of explaining this alternate version of Earth, and noticing that the moon is a little messed up, and The moon is where all of the kind of gross organic, cheesy substances that they don't want anything to do with on the earth. The moon is full of those things, and it also looks like it's starting to drip down toward the earth, and this is pretty upsetting. So he goes to pick up Sybil from work at the observatory, and he stops in and asks her, like, is everything okay with the moon? Things seem a little weird. And she says, oh yeah, it's fine. This was all as we predicted. It's getting closer. It's getting pulled into Earth's orbit. And then it's gonna be great because we'll have our own moon. Isn't this amazing? This like amazing capacity of the Earth to capture this thing and make it into its satellite. And Kufik says, I guess so, but like, are you sure that it's going to follow those predictions? Because I see some like cheesy strands getting closer and closer to the earth, and I don't know what's going to happen. And she says, don't worry, it's going to be fine. There might be a few little things that splatter down, but in the end, it's going to end up right where it needs to be. And then he, starts, I guess she finishes work. They start driving back home on the highway they live in like a kind of cookie cutter development in a subdivision. And as they're driving home, they're going through this clover leaf thing on the highway. That's a big landmark for them. And just looking up, and the sky is full of these like giant oozing strands of organic mess coming from the moon. And they're getting a little worried. So they get home, they're sitting in their rocking chairs watching this whole thing happen. And basically Sybil says another thing like, oh, this is kind of interesting. Like, what if it does splatter all over us? Like this would be fine. This would be interesting. And then right after that, the moon basically explodes onto the earth, and all of this slime covers them, and they have to spend the rest of the night digging themselves out of the sludge that's completely covered their neighborhood and supposedly the whole earth. They finally get out, but everything is different after that, and they can never retain their beautiful, clean, suburban synthetic lifestyle. They've kind of reverted to more animalistic behaviors. They're, like sitting in front of the TV eating cream puffs, and the narrator's like lamenting all the fall of Earth into this organic mess. And, basically just a complete reversal of what we currently imagine to be the difference between the Earth and the moon.
Right,
we're
exactly
covered in life and messy things, germs, and the moon is, out in space without any atmosphere, and barely anything can survive on there. So it's pretty sterile, although I guess not completely, since we have some little bits of ice and things with maybe microorganisms that we've harvested. So yeah, that's the story. And the piece, I'm just starting it, but it's eventually going to be an opera, like a full length, evening length opera. Probably not a really long one, but full size. At this point, I'm working on like a small chamber piece based on that will be kind of like a version of one of the moments from the story that will then develop into the opera in a future year. But I'm working with a group called Create Box. That's an ensemble based in Queens, in New York City, and also in Spain. And they're really great. They also do a lot with video. So we're going to be incorporating some projections, maybe some kind of like macro lens footage of things, really close up, like textures that evoke some of these different materials that come up so much in the soft moon. And I'm also just working on figuring out how I'm going to adapt a tiny fragment of that story into some very small set of lyrics that will work for a singer with ensemble. So that's where I am with the soft moon.
Well, I'm looking forward to it. And I think like you're like describing perfectly how I don't know, it's like his writing is so visceral that it wants to come to life in some way.
Definitely.
And it's been like, over 10 years since I read the Cosmicomics. Again, it's like I need to come back to it. But I actually wrote a piece inspired by, I think it's one of the first few chapters, like the first time light hits Earth. It's at daybreak, I think is the name of it.
Mm-hmm.
And it's been a very long time since I read it, so I can't like beautifully tell the story like you just did. But it's basically, the essence is like, it's the very early stages of the planet, and light, like the light of the sun has never shone on it, so like the whole world has always been black and white. And then finally, like the sun comes up over the horizon for the very first time, like ever. And he's describing all of the like different colors, and just the way he describes the colors of the daybreak for the, like, you're seeing it for the very first time in existence. I just was like so moved by that. And I wrote a piece for Drum Set and Electronics, actually.
Sweet. That sounds like such an amazing thing to, create into a piece of music.
Yeah, is grad school piece, so I think it's worthy of revisiting. But yeah, it's just like, how does he do that? Like, how does he come up with those combinations of words to like evoke those feelings about, really, I think the point of the Cosmicomics is it's like everyday, like regular stuff that he just like magnifies into like absurdity, like the moon melting like cheese.
Yeah, like the moon is made out of cheese. I don't know, just like he always is able to find some kind of like legendary thing from humans and combine it with like a scientific thing that we use to explain that legend, and kind of stick them together in these really weird ways, like our scientific understanding of the moon as like a satellite of Earth and how it might have formed. Because I guess there is a theory that it was like a giant asteroid or something passing by, and that it collided. There was a collision between that and the early Earth, and that broke off and then turned into a satellite, but there was a big exchange of materials. So like part of that theory relates to the story, but then there's also the cheesy,
right?
The moon is a big hunk of cheese kind of myth. Yeah, and all of the Cosmicomics have like some really tongue-in-cheek kind of way of bringing together science and mythology, I guess, or not even mythology, but like kind of just the like weird everyday expressions that we have to explain things we don't fully understand.
Oh yeah, I need to go read that now. You've inspired me. So I wanted to be sure we had time to talk about your more, I guess, for lack of a better word, like pop-oriented output of music. And so along with your husband, Nikki Adams, you formed GADADU, which you all describe as encompassing, and I'm going to quote this because there's no way I can like get this right on my own. It encompasses a kaleidoscopic sense of time and texture, weaving odd meter grooves, synth-spiked orchestral arrangements, and unorthodox song forms into a dreamy, soulful sound. So I think it's fair to say, just based on that this is a project that's deeply informed by your work as a composer, and you can speak more to that, I'm sure. But also, it's like not contemporary concert music. Like you listen to it, and it's it's like a song. It's not a piece, right? So can you share more about GADADU? What role does this cross-genre songwriting project have in your overall body of work as a composer?
Definitely. I actually, well, first of all, it took forever to come up with that description. It's really challenging to try to have a band that doesn't fall squarely into any genre. And this one does not. But I was thinking it's actually kind of the opposite. Like for me, the question is, how has GADADU influenced my composing of concert music? Because I started doing them around the same time, and GADADU and my concert music composing were happening simultaneously. So in one way, I felt like a need to keep them separate. And they also, of course, cross-pollinated. And I think I felt a need to keep them separate because my classical education and like composition studies and some of my teachers made me feel like I had to keep my songwriting stuff very separate and segregated almost from my concert music composition. And I've tried to do that, and ultimately I realized it was better just to let these things intermingle and, speak to each other, which I couldn't stop that from happening anyhow. But GADADU is, it's a project for both me and my husband Nikki to write songs, because we both like to write songs, and we were already doing it before we met. And then not long after we met, we started like collaborating and showing each other song sketches, and that turned into this band GADADU. And then, a year after, we were a duo for about a year, and then we started playing with some other musicians, including Patrick Adams, who's a trumpet player, also Nikki's brother. So now my brother-in-law. And originally we were playing with a drummer named Moses Eder, who now lives in New Orleans. He's a great player. And then Dan Stein on bass, upright bass at first, and then electric bass later on. Yeah, that was the instrumentation originally. And then when Moses, our first drummer, moved away from New York City, we started playing with Arthur Vint, who's a really great drummer, who now lives in Arizona. So there's been a lot of changeover. He was our drummer for many years, up until the pandemic, when during that time he moved back to Arizona, where he's from originally. And we also started playing with a tenor sax player named Ayumi Ishido. And she's really great. Also has, everyone in this band also has their own band, or at some point during this band had their own band. And so, it was always kind of crazy putting together rehearsals and gigs, but also a lot of fun. Just like, for me as a classical musician, I learned a ton by playing with all of these people who are mostly coming from a jazz background. And my husband is more a jazz musician more than he is a classical musician. And so I've learned a lot from him and his approach to songwriting. But basically, we each write songs kind of on our own, and then come together and work out some of the details and the arrangements. And yeah, with the band, I worked a lot on conciseness, I guess, kind of fitting a lot of musical ideas into a short, easily digestible container of a song, and also kind of learn how to leave things open to musicians and performers, especially musicians who can improvise, to try to make space for them to kind of let their voice be heard through the song in a way that's, more influenced by jazz. And, over the years, I've listened to tons and tons of different jazz musicians, and live, and also, recordings of the more legendary ones. And I just love that style and that whole tradition. And this band is kind of my small foray touching on jazz, but definitely I don't consider myself an expert by any means, just a huge fan, and someone who's always learning.
Yeah, for sure. So you said that you started this and composing at the same time, pretty much, and you were kind of discouraged by, I guess, teachers and like people you were studying with, discouraged to mix them together. Was that like a viola teacher or a composition teacher?
It was one of my composition teachers, who, yeah, like I had, it's a whole saga, but yeah, I was kind of drawing ideas from songs that I was writing, and going between writing them for wanting to compose chamber pieces based on song sketches from the band. And
yeah.
it was tricky, because my songs were not always like, they definitely weren't like standard pop songs in a pop song formation. And there were a lot of elements that would have worked well for chamber composition. But at the same time, I guess looking back on it, I kind of understand that advice from my composition teacher, even though back then I was frustrated by that. But I kind of, looking back on it, I understand the need to kind of be sensitive to the instruments you're working with when coming up with musical ideas. And I guess this depends on what kind of composer you are and what kind of music you write. Depends pretty seriously on those things. But yeah, there were a couple of pieces that I composed that were based off of songs. And now looking back on them, I'm like, well, maybe I could have thought more about the, instruments that I was writing for, and maybe this song wasn't the best fit for these instruments at that time. I don't know. Yeah, it's tricky. But then at the same time, I did a lot of orchestrational things with my arrangements in the band, and kind of got really crazy with layering and experimenting with like different kinds of vocal harmonies and like string textures, and blending tenor, sax, and trumpet with strings in unusual ways. So there's definitely a lot of cross pollination.
Yeah, I think it's always interesting when, and maybe with what I'm about to say, people might think I am being like negative interesting about this, but I just like it's neutrally interesting to me, like the relationship of concert composers to more popular styles, because I remember when I got into grad school, I'd played like in bands and stuff, and a lot of times speaking with composers on this podcast, even, I mean, a lot of people get that's like their initial foray into composition, is like hanging out in a band with their friends and writing songs. And so certainly I was no stranger to that, and I loved and continue to love all kinds of different musics. But I remember going into my first jury, and my jury in grad school as a composer, and the teachers gave us like all the stuff to prepare for, and it's like, be prepared to do like, show us that like that things about like instrument ranges on the piano, and score identification, like all the basic stuff. And then one of the things was like, come prepared to like play a pop song. And like I like freaked out because it's like, I don't know, like I'm not a singer, I can barely play piano. And I went in and I think I played some song by Beirut. I was really into that band at the time.
Nice.
And it was just like the same chord progression over and over again. And one of my teachers was like, what do you like about this song? It's like so basic. And I was like, well, like there's like all these different instruments, like it's hard. And they're like, oh, you're into timbre. And it's like, oh, I'm into timbre. Yes, you're right. And then like everything I've done since then is like very timbre oriented. But I go off on that sidetrack to say that I think it's a huge bummer when, I don't know, classical musicians think that like they can't learn anything from more popular music. And that was like a little eye-opening experience to me, that it's like, oh, I can actually enjoy the things I enjoy and actually cherry pick and learn from them, and come up with ways to like enhance my music through all the music that I listen to, really.
Yeah, totally. I share that sentiment. Like, I really think there's so much that we can learn as, people in the classical world, which is now kind of more broadly defined, I think, or has way more tangentially related musics. But yeah, just listening to other styles of music, not writing off pop music or more popular musicians, even though they might not be very popular, even if,
right.
But just other styles are so helpful to, for timbre, for rhythm, for especially rhythm. I feel like we often get so bogged down in other elements of music that we forget about rhythm and all of the amazing things that can be expressed and communicated through it. Yeah.
For sure. So getting into my final few questions, these are all questions I ask everybody, and I'll start off with, what do you think you would be doing if it wasn't your art? If you weren't making music, if you were not doing something in the arts, what do you think it would be?
Oh man. I often don't think about this question. What would I do if I weren't doing music? Because I can't really imagine myself doing other things. But it would have to probably be something that involves being outside. My kind of first thought is maybe I would end up just being a cemetery caretaker, because that's what my parents did when I was growing up, and they still work in cemeteries, not as caretakers, but in other roles. And I've always kind of thought, oh, if things aren't going so well and I just really want to have some, outdoor space and like peace and quiet, maybe I should just look for a cemetery that needs a caretaker. And usually, you can live there, and you work there. Actually, I met in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, where my dad lives. I met a cemetery caretaker who's also a musician, and I thought that's really cool.
Yeah.
Like he's in a band or something, and seemed like a really interesting person, and also worked in like a really cool old cemetery that has all of these like historical gravestones, and it's just really ornate and kind of expansive and interesting. So yeah, maybe a cemetery caretaker, maybe like something more rugged, like either I did some farm, I worked on a farm a little bit in college. So maybe farming or something that would involve probably not industrial farming, but like small scale farming, something that involves being outside, or even like trail maintenance, because I love hiking and being outdoors. I never did that though. And so having never done it and knowing a little bit about it, I don't know if I could handle it, because it's like the most intense, it's pretty intense manual labor. It's like moving giant boulders around. So don't, I'm not told, I think I could do it, but it would require serious, you know, skill set and also muscles that I currently lack.
I think those are two new answers for the podcast, especially the first one. That's great. Is there a tool that you use in your practice that you think everyone should know about and that everyone else could benefit from?
Yeah, I don't know if everyone, like I thought about this a lot, and I guess one thing that everyone could benefit from is sound walking. And this is, you know, by no means my thing. It's, you know, been promoted and kind of expanded by people like, especially Hildegard Westerkamp, who I wrote about in my dissertation. She's really kind of one of the original people who came up with the idea of sound walks. I just hesitate to say that it ever had a starting point, because I think part of being alive is like, you know, being surrounded by sound and hearing it and responding to it. So, but it's like that intentional practice of going out into the world, and just the way now that we have, ever since the advent of recording technology, we've been able to listen to sounds outside of their original context. So I think sound walking kind of comes out of that idea of like a synthetic sound world that we often immerse ourselves in, and taking that listening that we give to music, it seems like maybe a more finely attuned listening, heavier, more focused, and bringing it out into our everyday lives to let the world around us be a musical composition.
I love that. And I'll add that like the moments where I've allowed myself to do that, when it's like you slow down enough with your day to just like stop and listen to things. I mean, it's like it totally colors your world differently. Yeah. It's awesome.
I mean, it's hard. Like, we have to adapt ways to block out sounds in our lives. And so I feel like, especially in an urban setting, like we're way better at tuning out sounds than tuning into sounds. And it would be challenging for me to go out. I don't do it enough, like just around my neighborhood, listening to all. I mean, I guess maybe I do, but it's not real unless I'm really focused on it.
Yeah, that's fair enough. So my final question for you is, what is something you've never had a chance to say about your art that you've always wanted to share with people?
The one answer that makes sense to me is that I feel like it's the best things that I do are coming from beyond me. And it's kind of like, I won't get into like spirituality, because I don't really even know, I can't really articulate my own feelings, but I do feel like there's a much broader world out there and beyond what we experience, that is why we are connected to each other across time and space. And that goes back to Dream Journal, actually. Kind of that piece imagines the possibly supernatural ways that we are able to feel connected, even though we are physically separate. And so I just, feel like there's this broader than humans kind of like universal thing that draws out ideas. And we just have to make ourselves open to that. And it's not always easy. And that's why I think not all of my music has this quality, but once in a while there will be like a moment or an idea or a sound that comes up where I'm like, this thing has its own life, and it came through me, but it's not really my creation.
Yeah.
So that's what I would say.
I absolutely love that. And I think that's a perfect way to end this. Hannah, this has been so much fun, just getting to know you better, hearing more about what you're all about. And just thanks so much again for spending some time with me. I know things are kind of busy on your end, so I appreciate it.
Oh, no, it's been amazing getting to talk to you, Tyler. And I really appreciate all of your work, bringing together all of these different musics and composers and kind of serving as this nexus for the new music emerging composer world. It's really amazing, and it's really cool to hear your perspective on music and Italo Calvino and all kinds of other things. So thank you so much.
Oh, well, it's my pleasure. Just all such good stuff and so much to digest from that conversation. I just love the way Hannah is able to take these things that she's passionate about, like the outdoors or nature or just the nature of existence, really, and just connect them directly with her art in a meaningful and brilliant way. If you haven't heard any of Hannah's music yet, definitely check it out. She's online at hannahselin.com, and I'll have a link to that in the show notes for this episode. I'm Tyler Kline, and thank you so much for joining me for this episode of Music Maker. Music Maker with Tyler Kline is a production of Loose Leaf Transmissions, made for all ears. We are online at looseleaftransmissions.com, where you can find more episodes of this podcast, as well as ways to support the podcast and network. That'll do it for our time together today. Thanks so much again for listening, and I'll see you here next time for the next edition of Music Maker. Do take care.